Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick,
And I'm Gemma Files.
and this, of course, is No
No
Dark
darkness but
But
ours.
Ours.
That's it.
We're back. We're back. After
We're back. We're
a,
back. After, I realize that it hasn't seemed to be that long because Simon has so wonderfully been, making sure that we actually post stuff. But I've had to deal with a couple of things in my life, like my son getting chickenpox at the age of 18, and
oh, the joy.
yeah, I'm passing it around. And then I had to go and get the shingles vaccine. Yeah, yes, because I don't want to get shingles.
All
Um,
that fun shit.
all that.
Yes. So,
So all this and all that. So our topic for today, and possibly for later, is basically queer horror.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think this is gonna be, as the bishop said to the altar boy, this is gonna be a big one. Um, I was gonna say the bishop said to the actress, but we're gonna get hammered for
Why
this, I
not?
think.
Why not?
Um, but I mean, one quote that I was on the jury for a film festival recently, and I was in a conversation with one of the programs. He's a friend of mine, and he actually said at one point, because all horror is queer, and he was speaking as a straight white man, I should add as well. And this is an interesting. And it's an interesting one, but I kind of I thought I've heard that statement before, so I googled it and came across a few sort of articles essentially arguing the same thing, because so much of
Hmm.
horror is about kind of crossing boundaries. Sometimes we know we're doing it, sometimes we don't know about
Yeah.
it. It's about taboos, it's about desire, it's about desires that we're not supposed to acknowledge having or act out. And that's just, and this, of course, this is going to be something that a lot of, not just if you're gay or bisexual, but just anyone whose sexual tastes aren't entirely strictly vanilla or entirely orthodox
Yeah.
in any way,
Yeah.
is going to relate.
The idea of the rise of the repressed, the
Yeah.
idea of, I lived through the Madonna's sex era, the old phrase about having a dick in your brain. And and I think that, when I started to drift towards towards dark fantasy, Tanith Lee was my entry point, and when I
Oh
started
yes.
to drift towards horror, Clive Barker was my entry
Yeah.
point. And I've always been less interested in the default and more interested in the side action, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a bit of that for me in the sense I've often, I mean, we were talking a little bit before we started this podcast about, the whole kind of, as you say, the default. And even though I'm a cisgender straight white male and therefore about as default as you supposedly can get,
Yeah.
um, a lot of the books which I grew up reading, the main character is is a man who's usually tall and handsome, and confident, and has a great deal of physical courage and always knows what to do. None of which really describes me. I mean, I always kind of assumed I'd have the courage and the confidence and the stuff like that, and didn't really think that being a short ass was going to be that big a problem. I did like the fact that Jack Higgins, going back to him again, some of his best characters, like Liam Devlin, who's the kind of the IRA gunman, and the eagle has landed,
Yeah.
is described as being quite small. He's about 5'4" or 5. Whereas in the film he's played by Donald Sutherland, which was kind of like, hang on, I thought he was supposed to be. That's what?
It's true.
But the idea that you could be basically a little guy and still be hell on wheels was quite fun. But again, soon became clear whenever I encountered any kind of physical danger, my instinct was to obviously run away and hide. So I tried to have a lot of fights at school, usually on the assumption that you know I was in the right because these people were picking on me, and
Yep.
sheer righteous security would allow me to beat the crap out of them. And of course, it never worked out that way. Um, so in that sense, I mean, there's a kind of default that I've always kind of assumed I should try to be like, but really isn't me at all. So I can kind of understand that, that kind of like not being lack of
Yeah.
representation thing just from that, and a very, very minor scale, nothing like what it must be like for, you know, someone who's not
Yeah.
a cisgender straight white male. But
Well, and this is the thing. It's like often we have these liminal places that we occupy, and a cascading series of privileges as well.
yeah,
And you know, from my own point of view, again, I didn't identify with the default because I was a woman who didn't feel like a woman, because I was, because I was uh, a person who was supposed to act in a certain way and was completely incapable of acting in that certain way, and too much on every level. And and I think for both of us, when we looked at the default in terms of representation, we did not see ourselves represented there, and therefore, in a way, it's easier to apply that understanding of what it's like to not see yourself reflected in the stories told around you and the stories that you're attracted to, that every other person who has a cascading, set of or a lot or less privileges, in terms of representation, feels exactly the same way. It's like, it's like one of the people that I was attracted to hugely when I first found them was Poppy Z. Bright, who's now Billy Martin. And I always felt that Poppy and I kind of, were sort of coming at things from the same point of view. And we were in a lot of ways, except that Billy always knew he was a guy, literally trapped inside in the gender presentation of a woman. And I at some point had to go, no, I don't actually feel like that. There's a lot of stuff that I share, but I don't feel that's, it's like not only was that not an option when I was younger, but it's not an option I ever would have wished to go with either.
There's a lot of stuff about men getting it on, but this is kind of like there's a wonderful, I don't know if you ever saw it in Canada. There was a show called The Real McCoy in Britain.
Yeah.
It was black and Asian comedians.
Yes.
And there was one where they're interviewing like a guy who was supposed to be like the stereotypical, chauvinistic rapper.
Yeah.
And to say, so what? I'm not a sexist, blah blah blah. So what about this song of yours, beating around the bush? He says that's about how we need to go back to Africa. Because so how come the video for that had you lying with sitting with no shirt on in the back of a limousine while half a dozen sort of scantily clad women rub your body? Because I like that shit.
Yeah, exactly. Because I like that shit. And what more than anything else that I've been really happy to see over like the last 25 years of horror is that, we all may start from a point where we're like looking around at the default and going, where am I? But more and more, you're there. You're there because people are just like, because more and more people are being born into a world where they can claim themselves. I'm not saying it's like, it's like it's hard because for a while it was much better than it had been, and now it's sort of going back the other way around because everything is getting more fascist and more authoritarian and more fucked up and more censor, and more censor, like self-censoring. It's like, I'm just gonna keep things on the down low so that I don't get, shot as I'm walking down the street. But at the same time, people lived through like a nice chunk of time there where
I sometimes wonder how I might have turned out if I'd grown up and there'd been more and I'd been reading more stuff like that. In terms of queerness, I've always considered myself pretty much heterosexual. I've never been attracted to men. That said, I found a lot of trans women very attractive, including genitals and all.
Yeah.
And there's that kind of thing. Well, I mean, it's like I can't pretend that I don't register any difference between cisgender women and transgender women, but I know that a penis wouldn't be a deal breaker for me if I was, if all else was equal and if I was not in a monogamous relationship. I mean, quite frankly, I don't understand how polyamorous people manage to do it, because one relationship takes sort of time and energy.
So much.
But again, so I don't know if that puts me somewhere on the queer axis or not.
I don't know either. I mean, the thing is that you could, if you looked at what I did day to day, you might say, well, you're a cisgender white woman who is in a heterosexual marriage, who has bred and had a child and and on the other hand, I'm not doing almost anything on a daily basis that's sexual, but my brain is it's a sum. Well, and it always has been. It's like one of the things I like about my brain is that I can look at people and go like, oh yeah, no, I could do that. Yeah, that would be interesting. That'd be kind of neat.
It's part of where the umbrella term queer kind of comes from, in the sense of you can't. I mean, for example, if you were bisexual and your husband was bisexual, you could be married with kids. You could be out. Everything from the outside presents itself.
And a lot of bisexual people complain about lack of visibility, and also about people basically making assumptions about their bi-ness. It's like, if you're in a straight relationship, you're straight. If you have kids, you're cis. Yeah. It's like, I know a guy married to a guy who was the person who gave birth to their twin sons, and I remember him when he was that person.
Right.
I made out with him at a party actually once. When he was that person,
right,
and he was always that person, right?
It's confusing. It's even finding the language to kind of talk about this in a way that is clear.
Yeah.
Because if you're, I mean, can we say in the case this person was at that time living as a woman, or is that?
Yeah, I think that would probably. Yeah, that would probably be it. Yeah, at that time, that person was assigned female at birth and was living that life. They were living with that gender presentation.
Again, finding it's. I mean, Stuart Lee once said that political correctness is an often, albeit clumsy, negotiation to try and find a more conclusive language, and it is often, albeit clumsy, really it's very hard to try and you're trying to find a way to say things in a way that's clear and direct, and at the same time trying to say them in a way that aren't going to come across as grossly insensitive.
Yeah, and yet people within themselves, it's like I've written a lot of stuff that takes place in a different time period.
Yeah,
and where was that fanfic that I had posted on Archive of Our Own, it would come with trigger warnings like, period specific homophobia, period typical homophobia, internalized homophobia, right?
Yeah, these are the difficult, because when you're writing something in a historical setting, it's kind of like, well, a lot of people, I mean, of course, even in the less enlightened past, there were people who had far more enlightened attitudes towards queerness, but of course those people were much more in the minority and often a lot more quiet. They were much you would find even people who would otherwise be reasonably progressively minded could still have views on certain subjects like sexuality or whatever that by modern standards are kind of like, oh my god, that's fucking medieval.
Did you ever see a Glenn Close film called Albert something or other? I want to say Albert Brooks, but it's not. Where she plays a guy who was assigned female at birth and is living as a man and has gotten a job as a butler.
Okay, that's
and ends up like romancing Mia Wasikowska, I think, to try and get her to enter into a relationship with him as sort of his beard wife, and
is this Albert Nobbs?
That's it, Albert Nobbs. Yes, and the moment where Albert understands that there are a lot more people out there like him than he ever thought there were is when he runs into another person assigned female at birth who is also living as a man, who is Janet McTeer. You know, and
fantastic.
it's easier for Janet McTeer's character because she's big. She's a big person, you know, and you know, as opposed to Glenn Close, who's, you know, like this little tiny person with tiny feet and tiny hands, and you know,
there's that whole thing of passing and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, but the point is that there have always been Albert Nobbses. There have always been, you know, it's like, and even now we're, you know, we're always having debates about how would these people have seen themselves.
Yeah.
You know, and I've forgotten his name, of course, the surgeon who,
James Barry?
Yes, James Barry, Dr. James Barry. Dr. James Barry, I'm pretty sure, thought of himself as a dude.
Yeah.
You know, it's like he fought.
It can be hard because there's quite. I mean, there's been cases through history.
Duels over the fact that people, you know, made assumptions about him.
Yeah.
And he fought duels just because he wanted to fight them. Because he was a piss artist.
There's been many cases in that history of women who have essentially dressed up as men in order to go to join the army to fight. Now, how much of that has been because they thought of themselves as men, and how much of that has been because they thought of themselves as women, but wanted a life that was on their own terms?
And there are certainly people like that as well. I can think of like about 3 different soldiers from the Civil War, who later, you know, got their pension and then put dresses back on and went.
It would be fascinating to hear their stories and say, of course, a lot of them probably wouldn't have spoken openly or honestly about necessarily how they saw themselves.
Absolutely.
Maybe how many of them would have even been able to articulate the idea of themselves, you know, I'm really a man.
Absolutely.
Whatever.
And, you know, one of the interesting things about Dr. James Barry is that after his body was examined when he was dead, it was fairly obvious that he had borne a child at some point.
Good Lord.
And I wonder whether it was at that moment that he went, you know what? I can't do this. I cannot live this life. It can't be done.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I'm going to do whatever I can do to not live this life anymore. I also wonder what happened to that kid.
I watched that film X the other night, you know, with Mia Goth.
Yes, yeah.
And there is that thing which is, you know, I will not accept a life that is less than I deserve, which is both kind of her mantra for herself, but also, you know, it is that whole thing where I kind of guessed the kind of payoff that she would be the evangelist's daughter.
Yes.
Pretty much at the beginning. But that thing, that is kind of a mantra of his, and it's a mantra of hers, but they both derived completely different conclusions from it.
That's true. Yeah, Pearl's just like, I'm going to fuck anything I can. You know, it's like, if I have to kill people, it's fine. You know?
And that's not necessarily a queer film in the sense of, I mean, there isn't any same-sex act. Well, I mean, there's the bit when the young sort of church mouse girl is kind of about to involve herself in the film, and the 2 other women are kind of caressing her a bit as she undresses.
But also, for the most part, also Pearl's obsession with Maxine is kind of interesting.
Yes,
particularly because Mia Goth is obsessed with Mia Goth.
Yeah, that's just brilliant, and she's just it really underlines what a fantastic actress she is, as well as everything else. Again, though, I mean, it's interesting in a sense of queerness. Certainly, while the people who are going to make this porn film aren't being shown as having any same-sex attraction. Certainly, in terms of their sexualities, or in terms of how they perceive their role of sexuality in their lives, it's queer in the sense of it's at odds with the it's at odds with the mainstream. It's about very much.
So if we think of queer as being inherently at odds with the mainstream, you know, multiple sexual partners without necessarily becoming obsessed with those people or even loving those people in a quote normal way, but not
Yes.
not loving them either. You know,
Yeah. It's like
being able to perform for a camera, being able to, and yet have a relationship with somebody outside of that or inside of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's. I suppose it's that thing when you realize that sex and love are two different, are very much, the two of them do not necessarily have to go together. And
Yeah.
it took me quite a while to kind of learn that lesson. But yeah. So and yes, and again, this is. I mean, it's. I love the way, like some of the films I've seen, it's inverted a lot of the slasher tropes beautifully, and that you think the girl who is almost earmarked as the final girl, the church mouse, as they often call her, she actually she's like a virginal and, but she's actually fascinated and really turned on by it, and goes in. But that doesn't kill her. What kills her is when she rejects that and kind of. And I felt sorry for her because I thought at the same time I could understand that reaction, but I really hated that the character did that in the same time, because I thought that I found that part, her journey there, I actually found that really touching. But it's when she actually retreats to that previous kind of prudish, oh, sex is bad kind of position, that she immediately runs off and gets killed.
Well, but I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the slasher in general, the slasher model, which is always that to some degree, it's about the assumptions that we make about each other. And, it's like, what do you, quote, quote, deserve to die for, right? Do you deserve to die for fucking? Do you deserve to die for not fucking? Do you deserve to die for deciding to fuck and then not fucking? Do you deserve to, and the fact is that you don't deserve to die for anything. Deserve's got nothing to do with it, son. In
many ways, from one level, a lot of the time, it's you become a target of opportunity because you're going off to do something that society doesn't approve of, or that your parents won't approve of. You want to have a shag, but you have to sneak off somewhere into the woods or whatever, which is where the serial killer is hanging around looking for the victim.
There's a friend of mine who's kind of, I won't say obsessed with, but she has this interesting interest in sex work, and she's very interested in writing characters who are sex workers. And to some degree, because she's like, well, sex work is work. And if we're saying that sex work is work, then it's a job like any other thing. But also because, we live in a matrix, we live in a society, we live in a society where, the assumption is sex work is work that you go to because you can't do anything else. Sex work is work that you fall into and then you can never get out of it. Blah, 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 blah. Consent.
And that is probably, and that may be true for some people, isn't it?
Absolutely. But and that thing that, that Jack the Ripper holdover thing of, if you choose to do this, you choose to live in sin, and you may be killed for that sin. You make yourself vulnerable, right? Why would you do that? Why would you make yourself vulnerable? And I'm like, in a world full of and misogyny and things that are slanted completely towards the privileging of men's sexuality over women's sexuality, het men's sexuality over women's sexuality, then just walking down the fucking street and having a pair of boobs is is you making yourself vulnerable. is making yourself, exactly. Man, put a bra on those.
I can understand. I mean, again, it is a different thing, but I understand the fear of going out, because as someone, I've got quite a bad weight problem, and that which at the moment translates itself into quite a bad mobility problem as well. But I've had that thing of you go out in public and people, if you're overweight, people will feel they have a right to pass comment on it. Often very insulting. From the, you should lose weight, mate, or you need to lose some weight, mate. I mean, it's like, you think I haven't looked in the middle, to oh, you fat fuck, or which I got a lot of when I lived in Manchester, and which produced an awful lot of fantasy.
Do you need 2 chairs? Do you need like a whole Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
was at a book signing a couple of years ago, and it was like the show had a metal frame, and at one point I sort of looked down at my shoulder at something, I felt something shift, and then the frame kind of like buckled under me, and kind
Oh,
of almost gently and gracefully lowered me to the floor, which it was more
yeah,
embarrassing than anything else. And everyone
yeah,
was lovely about it. The staff, I think the
yes.
staff at the shop were far more worried about what was has he been injured than he's fucked one of our chairs up, the fat bastard.
But it,
Um,
but at the same time, I absolutely understand. The highest weight I ever was, I went to, Australia to see my dad. I had to go from a plane to a plane to a plane to a plane to a plane. It was one of those, like 5 different flights to get to Australia, right? And I remember that I spent most of it like this, with my,
yeah,
with my elbows crossed as close to myself as they could
yeah,
be. Like
yeah.
that's a
Again, it's
day and a fucking half of
again, it's
trying not to
another example of not
touch
being
anything. Yeah.
another example of not being part of the default. The world is not built with people like you in mind.
Yeah.
We went to Wales last year, and we usually actually we travel a lot of the way by bus. We get a train to Wrexham and then bus it from there to the coast, which is quite easy to do. But at one point, we went further up the coast. We caught a train, and the aisles on this train very narrow, and it's not only it's uncomfortable and awkward, and it makes you extremely self-conscious, and you're aware of the other people you're going past and trying
Yeah.
not to squash into, and you are
Yeah.
probably thinking, "Oh God, what a disgusting spectacle."
Yeah.
The whole thing becomes both physically and emotionally quite distressing.
Yeah.
Uh, Luckily, we had to change trains a couple of times because they had problems on the line. Luckily, the lady who was
Yeah.
the carriage attendant was absolutely lovely to us both.
Oh, it's
I think
nice.
she's had a couple of passengers talk horribly to her. We were like, no,
Yeah.
we're not blaming you. She's like, it's all right. We won't have to do this again. I'm so sorry. But yeah, it's one. That's. It's a very different example of I can choose. In theory, I can choose not to be fat. People keep telling me, but it's not a quick process.
No,
Even if
it's
I
not.
decide, no matter if I commit to salads and 12-mile walks, 12-mile daily walks, from tomorrow onwards, it's still going to be a period of months before I stop being overweight.
Yeah.
Even when I remember one point being heckled as a fat bastard by kids, even after I'd lost half a stone that week.
Oh my God.
Because
Yeah.
there was that much still
Yep.
to go.
One time I was crossing the street with Cal. This dude came by so fast on a scooter, and I just froze in the middle of the street. I actually had the right of way. He almost went into me, and so I'm like frozen there in the middle of the and Cal's like, "Run, mom, run!" And I'm just like, and this guy, as he zips past me, goes, "Get out of the way, you fat bitch!" I was just like,
there really are
that was what
times.
broke me. That was what broke me.
Yeah.
And I just turned around and went, "Fuck you!"
Yeah,
After the dude.
there really are times when you wish you could go armed, where you sometimes think maybe these open carry assholes have a point after all, because you think, if I just had a 9mm Browning under my arm.
But they so do not. That's the point. You shouldn't be
Yeah.
able to. You shouldn't, think that it's okay to scream, "Get out of the way, you fat bitch!" But at the same time, you shouldn't get shot for doing that either.
No, I can fantasize, because the great thing about being a writer is you can fantasize about it. You can write that kind of shit down and you'll feel an awful lot better.
Yes, that is absolutely true.
Since moving to where we live now, I've had far less of that kind of abuse, but I did get some when I went to the park one time, and I was kind of like, I was kind of like making myself go out because I've struggled because of things like depression and anxiety. That's also made it hard to go out. So I kind of had to psych myself up to go for a walk to the park because my back pain will kick in before I've gone very far. And as I walked around, slowly around the big sort of pond in the centre of it, I went past these bloody kids, and one of them starts going, "Fatty lad, fatty lad." It's like, yes, I've not even noticed. But he started it again as I was walking back, and I finally snapped. I said, "I'm not, at least not a fucking little cunt like you." or something along those lines. It's kind of a cheeky bastard as I went away. But I then went home and wrote a story where this fat guy is getting this kind of abuse from a kid, and then he sort of lures the kid after him, and suddenly his body hinges open, and all these tentacles fly out. Because he's a Lovecraftian monster and eats the child, and then later on dumps the bones in the pond where they won't be found. And it's like, I felt so much better after doing that.
No, exactly. And, you know, and I often find that that is the way that it works when you intersect with your non-defaultness. And, you know, so let's say you begin as a consumer of story wanting to find yourself reflected in the stories that you consume. And at first, the only things that you find are negative reflections, where it's like, you know, you can tell that that woman is evil because she's fat. You can tell that that guy is evil because he's gay. You can tell that that lady is evil because she's not a lady at all. You know, you can it's like you can tell that that person is evil because, you know, they're a dour black person. Whatever. You know, whatever's not the default. Whatever's, you know, and then you're like, okay, fine. So I want to be, you know, I want to be a gay Disney villain. You know, I want to be Ursula. I want to be, you know, it's like, and then you move into like the second thing, which is, you know, so I'm going to create this monstrous version of myself, which is a wish fulfillment version. The wish fulfillment version of, oh, you think I'm a witch? Yeah, you bet your ass I'm a witch. I'm going to curse your I'm going to curse your pasty, you know, skinny ass, you know, pretty soon.
It's the kind of thing, but I would kind of flip it in a slightly different way where, you know, I would make the people who'd been, I tried to make, trying to change the kind of underlying concept, the underlying assumptions of what was good and what was bad.
Yes.
Because I liked those kind of thrillery narratives with kind of straightforward goodies and baddies to an extent, but at the same time, I just thought, well, the people you're assigning as the goodies and baddies here are all it's all fucked up.
Yeah.
I think I've moved. I mean, and sometimes that would mean flipping around who was the good guy and who was the bad guy in a situation. But sometimes that could be a bit simplistic at times. I think I've moved past that, but it was certainly a useful tool, and certainly I think when it comes to writing characters, a lot of the time I try to write. Increasingly, I think I've tried to write characters who aren't particularly like me, because I find myself kind of rather boring, or rather, if I try to make a character who's very like me, then I often won't be able to see what's interesting.
Yes.
Because everybody's life has got a material that's interesting, but often, you know, we don't see that in ourselves. Other people's lives look more interesting. Other people's experiences look more interesting.
Yeah.
So often, and maybe it's part of having once been or wanted to be an actor, of that thing of, you know, it's like a role. You take a character, you put yourself into them, you find stuff that's like you, you find stuff that isn't like you, and you get to explore all that. Certainly lately, quite a few of my characters have been gay women, and I'm actually probably more. And a lot of the time, I think I'm actually more comfortable writing female characters or female protagonists than I am male ones.
I mean,
in a kind of way.
I know for myself, I made a decision a while ago, in much the same way that I made a decision not to show male on female rape. Or, I mean, you know, it's like, yes, people often say, Gemma, those consent issues are whack. What's wrong with you? You know, but I will say that very little actual, from my point of view, RAPE makes it into my stuff. It's like I may talk about stuff that happened in the past, but that's about it. I
think erotica writers have the term dubious consent, or
dub fine,
don't they?
Yes, dub fine, non-con. Those are the two things. And, you know, if people are like, do you have like some kind of fetish for that thing? I'll be like, motherfucker, I do. It is true. But you know,
what's wrong with being a pervert?
You know, what are you gonna say? But, you know, similarly, I made a decision a while ago to write queer characters as much as possible. Mainly because why not? Why not?
Yeah.
You know, it's like there's so many, you know, it's like there's so many inherent mechanics. I mean, I had a conversation at a script reading not too long ago, where half the audience were like, why don't you have those two people, that man and that woman character, date each other, because they obviously care for each other a lot. And the guy who wrote the script, who is quite a young dude, quite a zillennial, I guess, you know, was like, because that would be really obvious, and I really wanted to have two people who were friends, who happened to be a man and a woman, and love each other like that, you know, because you don't see enough of that. And this is like the third phase. The third phase is no, sorry, I guess the fourth phase. The third phase is then you just start writing about yourself the way that you are, because fuck it, and why not? And then you start making decisions like, well, what do I think that people want to see? Not in a, you know, so that I can sell stuff, but more like, you know, what's lacking? What is it that I can do that, you know, to plug a little bit of that hole?
What's interesting, what's different, what's
interesting, what's different, what's not predictable. And you know, so
yeah, I mean, it's both on a I suppose in a moral sense and in an aesthetic sense. It is actually better to write characters who have that kind of diversity, where you are getting away from the defaults as much as possible. It makes the work richer and more interesting, I mean, obviously, you know, you don't want to be kind of stealing this stuff from obviously.
This is the other thing that we have to get into, which is the whole idea of, you know, cultural stealing of what the fuck is that called?
Cultural appropriation.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have to get into the whole idea of cultural.
There's often this thing of even people who sort of say, you know, don't culturally appropriate, I'll often admit it's very hard to provide, you know, because you ask, well, in that case, give me a hard and fast demarcation of what constitutes, you know, where the line is of what's appropriation and what's not. And even those people usually admit, well, there isn't one really. We know it when we see it. It's like, thanks, that's great.
No, no, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you know, it is very much we know it when we see it, much like porn, much like porn, much like fascism. You know, it's like, you know, when you see it. And it's
one gay writer who had a look at some of my work, but I'd written a gay character and not done it. Writing gay men I've actually found trickier, probably because, and I've realised this now, I've fallen to not so much I wasn't trying to stereotype, it was more a case of I was trying to find a kind of a voice, and so for the character, and this kind of arch, sort of slightly camp tone kind of came quite. It works really well in one story.
F-E-Y.
Yes. Called As the Crow Flies, which is told from the point of view of the deceased Piers Gaveston, favourite of Edward II. Quite pleased with it. And the writer who had a look at it, James Bennett, really good writer, was fine with that. But a couple of others where I'd kind of done something similar, he wasn't. He critiqued more in depth. I think one of the things he did say was representation is great. But if you're trying to sort of, I think where it would get problematic is where if you're trying to write about, oh, you know, the terrible, you know, the harshness and the rigors that gay people have to go through, because that's not it's one thing to write a character who's gay.
Yeah.
It would be like if I was, as a white person, I shouldn't really be writing, you know, how terrible, you know, the experience of black people under racism is, because you know, again, that's kind of trespassing on that is kind of trespassing in a sense.
So that's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is like what you're actually trying not to appropriate is the more negative aspects, the more difficult aspects, the more tragic aspects of being on the default. And no, that's absolutely true. And you know,
you can't get away in some senses from showing some aspects of that, because otherwise, because again, you're not being realistic if you don't show that there are fucking arseholes out there who will dislike you because of who and what you are. But there are plenty of horror stories you can tell where people, as Paula Ash points out in her collection, we are here to hurt each other.
Yes.
Which is a nice little segue into our next episode, where we'll be discussing the work of emerging contemporary queer horror writers like Paula Ash and Hayley Piper, and queerness in classic horror fiction. Until then, I have been Simon Bestwick.
And I have been Gemma Files. And this, of course, has been No Darkness,
No Darkness,
but Our House.